A flight attendant punched a black teen in the nose for simply asking for water. Blood poured down his face, but when his father walked on in a judge's robe, the attendant froze in horror. What happens next will leave you speechless. He hit a thirsty teen just for asking for water, blood on the aisle, silence in the cabin. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The fist came without warning. A sharp crack echoed through the aisle as Darren Coyle's knuckles connected squarely with Caleb Stroud's nose. The blow landed with such force that the boy's head snapped back against the seat, and for an instant, the entire cabin seemed to freeze. Caleb's eyes widened in disbelief, his hands flying up instinctively as warm blood spilled between his fingers. A cry tore from his throat, breaking the fragile quiet that had lingered in the dimly lit plane. Passengers gasped, their whispers rising like a tide as shock rippled through the rows. Darren loomed over him, his broad shoulders casting a shadow in the narrow aisle. His chest rose and fell with quick, heavy breaths, his face twisted with something ugly. Contempt mixed with a simmering rage that seemed far larger than the moment that had sparked it. He did not apologize. He did not retreat. Instead, he stared down at the 16-year-old as though Caleb had committed an offense so grave it warranted punishment. His lips curled into a sneer, his jaw set with an arrogance that dared anyone to challenge him. Caleb's ears rang. The dull throb in his face drowned out the low hum of the engines. His vision blurred as he pressed trembling hands against his bleeding nose, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth. His mind spun with disbelief. He had only asked for water, just a glass to soothe the dryness in his throat. How had such a simple request been twisted into this nightmare? His body shook, not just from the pain but from the humiliation of being struck in front of strangers. Around him, passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. A man in the row ahead half rose before sinking back down, glancing nervously at Darren's imposing figure. Another whispered to his companion, their eyes fixed on Caleb's bloodied face. The cabin was dim, the overhead lights muted, yet the stark red against Caleb's pale skin was impossible to ignore. Phones were lifted discreetly, screens glowing as some passengers began to record. The tension was thick, pressing down like the cabin air itself, and yet no one spoke loudly enough to break it. Darren's voice finally cut through the silence, low and seething. "You think you can talk to me like that?" His words dripped with disdain, though the boy had done nothing but repeat his request. His tone carried the weight of accusation, as though Caleb were guilty of insolence simply by existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Caleb's lips trembled as he tried to respond, his voice strained and broken. I just asked for water." The words were weak, muffled by the tissue he pressed against his face, but they carried a truth that made Darren's anger seem all the more senseless. For a moment, their eyes locked. Caleb's were wide and shining with pain, but somewhere deep within them flickered defiance, the faint but steady reminder of what his father had always told him. Stand firm when you know you are right. Darren's gaze, however, burned with a warning, daring the boy to push back further. The hum of the engines returned to Caleb's ears as his surroundings sharpened again. The murmur of passengers grew louder, some indignant, others fearful. He could feel the weight of their stares, the silent question hanging in the air. Would anyone intervene, or would this moment pass like so many injustices before, swallowed by silence and fear? Caleb leaned back, the pain throbbing with each heartbeat. His breaths came shallow, his chest tightening as humiliation washed over him. He had dreamed of telling his father about the debate tournament, about standing proudly with his team as they won second place. Instead, here he was, bloodied, trembling, and unsure if his voice would even be believed. Darren straightened, glancing briefly at the passengers as if daring them to challenge his version of events. His breathing slowed, but his fists remained clenched at his sides, knuckles still reddened from the impact. In the dim light, his presence filled the narrow aisle like a storm cloud, looming, oppressive, dangerous. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat raw. The sting in his nose spread to his eyes, tears mixing with the blood as he tried to steady himself. His young mind struggled to grasp what had just unfolded. This wasn't a school debate where words were weapons and logic ruled the field. This was something darker, a brutal reminder that truth and fairness could be crushed in an instant by those who wielded power without conscience. Passengers shifted again, the murmurs rising, and yet no one moved to touch Darren. No one called out his violence for what it was. The imbalance of fear and authority lingered heavy in the stale air, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. Caleb sat frozen in that moment, pain and disbelief swirling together, knowing that his life had changed in a single violent heartbeat. And as Darren stood above him, breathing hard and glaring down at the boy who had dared to ask for water, the silence spread through the cabin like frost, chilling every witness who saw what had happened. The boy's world had just shattered in one violent blow. Blood streamed down Caleb's nose as gasps erupted through the cabin, the metallic tang filling the air around him. The boy pressed his hands to his face, the napkins given to him instantly soaked crimson. His breath came in shallow bursts, each one shaky, the world around him spinning from both the blow and the shock. The silence after the strike lasted only a moment before voices rose like a storm. Passengers cried out, some shouting for help, others fumbling with their phones, their screens glowing as cameras lifted shakily into the air. The hum of the engines was drowned by chaos, the once quiet cabin now alive with outrage. "Calm down," Darren barked, his voice harsh and commanding. He stood tall in the aisle, fists still clenched at his sides, his broad shoulders tense as if daring anyone to step forward. He was disrespectful. His words carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed, but beneath the surface of his tone flickered something else. Fear. It showed in the tightness around his eyes, in the way he scanned the passengers like a cornered man searching for an escape. Caleb tried to lean back against his seat, his trembling hands pressing the napkins harder to his face. Blood seeped through anyway, staining his shirt with spreading blotches of red. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, the humiliation stinging worse than the pain. A simple request, he thought numbly. Just water. And now he was the center of the storm. The weight of eyes on him made his stomach twist, each whisper and murmur cutting deeper than the bruise forming on his face. An elderly man rose shakily from across the aisle, gripping his armrest for balance. His voice rang out, strong despite his age. "Captain! Someone get the captain! This is assault!" His words carried indignation, trembling with anger. Darren whirled on him, his face twisting with irritation. With a shove, he pushed past the old man, muttering through clenched teeth, "Troublemakers." Always troublemakers. The man stumbled but caught himself, glaring back with fury, though his voice was drowned by the swelling commotion. The cabin's atmosphere shifted from disbelief to outrage. Passengers exchanged looks, some rising slightly in their seats as if debating whether to intervene. Yet Darren's looming presence in the aisle, his tall frame, his piercing glare, kept them seated. He was known among the crew for his temper, and even the flight attendants at the rear whispered nervously to each other, their faces pale, unwilling to challenge him directly. Their hesitation only deepened the sense of injustice hanging heavy in the air. Caleb blinked rapidly, tears mingling with the blood on his cheeks. His head throbbed, but his mind swirled with a sharper ache, confusion. How could asking for water lead to this? His throat was dry, his words trapped, but inside him another feeling began to take root. Shame twisted into anger, and humiliation began to spark into resolve. He wanted to vanish into his seat, yet he knew running from this moment would only hand Darren victory. A presence leaned closer. A businessman in a neat suit, his tie loosened, his brow furrowed with quiet concern. Lewis Granger placed a steady hand on the armrest between them and whispered, his voice low but steady. "Stay strong, son. Keep your head up. People are watching." His words were not loud, but they carried weight, like a lifeline thrown across turbulent waters. Caleb lifted his eyes briefly, nodding faintly, his lips pressed tight to stop them from trembling. Darren's gaze swept the rows, narrowing as he noticed phones raised, passengers recording his every move. His jaw tightened. He straightened, puffing out his chest as if trying to reclaim the authority that had begun to slip away. "He lunged at me first," he declared, his tone booming down the aisle. "I was defending myself." He jabbed a finger toward Caleb, but the blood on the boy's face betrayed his lie. Murmurs of disbelief rippled among the passengers. A young man muttered angrily, "Defending yourself from a kid?" Darren ignored him, but his lips pressed thin, his composure unraveling with each skeptical glare. Caleb's thoughts spun wildly. Would anyone believe him? Or would Darren's uniform, his authority, overshadow the truth of what had happened? He thought of his father waiting at the arrival gate, his father who believed in the power of truth, in the idea that justice was not a favor, but a right. Would his father believe that a simple glass of water had led to this violence? The answer, deep in Caleb's heart, was yes. His father would believe him. But belief was not enough. Not here. Not now. Not when lies were already taking root. The hum of the plane seemed louder, vibrating beneath the chaos. Darren paced slowly down the aisle, scanning faces, his eyes sharp with suspicion. Each step was deliberate, meant to remind the passengers of his presence, to reclaim the fear he thrived on. His hand twitched slightly at his side, betraying nerves he fought to conceal. He leaned down again, close enough for Caleb alone to hear, his voice a venomous whisper. "Keep quiet about this, boy, or you'll regret it." Caleb flinched, his stomach tightening at the threat, but he forced himself not to look away. His father's voice echoed in his mind, words spoken so many times before. "Always stand firm when you know you're right." Caleb drew strength from them now, gripping the napkin against his nose, refusing to bow under Darren's glare. In the rear, the whispering attendants exchanged uneasy glances. Their indecision lingered like smoke, thick and suffocating, as if the entire cabin held its breath waiting for someone, anyone, to act. But no one did. Not yet. And so Caleb sat in silence, battered but unbroken, his thoughts a storm of pain, fear, and determination. Around him, passengers shifted uneasily, some turning their phones toward him with quiet solidarity, others averting their eyes in fear of becoming targets themselves. The boy's humiliation burned, but deeper still was the flicker of something stronger, the will to endure, to not let this moment break him. He wiped his bloodied face, his vision blurred but his mind sharpening with clarity. Somewhere ahead, his father was waiting, unaware of the battle unfolding high in the sky. Caleb swallowed hard, lifting his chin ever so slightly despite the pain. Justice, he thought, steadying himself against the storm, has to begin with truth. The captain's voice broke through the tense silence, steady and calm, carried across the cabin through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, order must be maintained. All complaints and concerns will be addressed once we land. Please return to your seats." The announcement rolled over the passengers like a forced curtain drop, silencing outbursts but not the unease that lingered in every nervous glance. Darren smirked, his lips twisting with smug satisfaction, as if the words were proof that authority had chosen his side. His broad shoulders loosened, his steps more confident now, while the boy who bled sat pressed against the seat, his shirt stained, his breathing uneven. Caleb felt the vibration of the engines beneath him, but it was nothing compared to the pounding of his heart. The teenager sat upright, stiff as a board, his hands trembling slightly as he pressed napkins to his swollen nose. His mind wrestled with the pain, but even more with the humiliation. Around him, the passengers bore silent witness. Some averted their eyes, unwilling to be drawn into conflict, while others met his gaze with brief nods of solidarity. A man in a gray suit, Lewis, leaned just enough to whisper, his words meant only for Caleb. "Do you know who's meeting you at the airport?" His voice was low, calm, yet heavy with intent. Caleb hesitated, tasting the copper tang of blood at the back of his throat. He swallowed, then whispered back, "My dad. He's a judge." Lewis's brows lifted in a flicker of recognition. His lips curved into a faint smile, but his tone was steady when he murmured, "Then, don't worry. The truth has a way of finding daylight." He leaned back again, his eyes sharp, scanning Darren as if preparing for the storm that was bound to follow. But Darren was not deaf to the undercurrent. His ears, tuned to suspicion, caught fragments of whispers that passed between rows. He paused mid-step, his smirk wavering as unease crept across his face. He turned sharply, his eyes narrowing on Caleb. The boy's hands were still pressed against his face, his breathing quiet, but Darren bent low, close enough that Caleb could feel the man's breath against his ear. "Keep quiet about this, boy," Darren hissed, his voice like venom dripping through clenched teeth, "or you'll regret it." Caleb flinched, his chest tightening, but his eyes, those sharp, determined eyes, did not drop. His father's voice rang in his mind, clear as a bell. "Always stand firm when you know you're right." The boy inhaled shakily, fighting back the fear that pressed against his ribs and lifted his chin, a small act of defiance but enough to steady his heart. Darren straightened, his glare burning with silent threat, but the smirk did not return. The cabin seemed frozen in uneasy suspense. Some passengers had seen the exchange, their eyes darting between the man and the boy, torn between silence and outrage. A young man a few rows back slid his phone discreetly down from shoulder height, screen glowing faintly as he hit upload. He wasn't the only one. Across the cabin, others had already shared their recordings, clips of Darren's fist connecting with Caleb's face, the sound sharp, the boy's cry piercing. In the small, confined space thousands of feet above the ground, truth had already begun to spread beyond the walls. Caleb, unaware of the digital storm gathering, focused on breathing, on keeping his hands steady and his courage intact. His nose throbbed, his vision swam faintly, but there was something inside him now, something unyielding. He was no longer just a boy asking for water. He was a witness carrying his father's teaching like armor. Darren paced once more, his heavy steps echoing down the aisle. The passengers followed him with watchful eyes, no longer just silent strangers but quiet guardians of what they had seen. Tension crackled in the recycled air, like a storm waiting for the ground to break beneath it. And far below, in the bustling terminal of Dalmere City Airport, Judge Malcolm Stroud glanced at his watch. The man's black robe still carried the scent of polished oak and old paper from the courtroom he had left only an hour earlier. He tapped the face of the watch, unaware that his son, bleeding and silent, was sitting above the clouds, holding fast to courage while the world below was already beginning to roar with outrage. By the time the plane's wheels touched the runway, strangers across the nation would have seen what had been done. Caleb pressed his eyes shut, his father's words echoing once more, steadying him as the weight of what had happened pressed down. He did not know it yet, but the moment Darren's fist struck had set far more than his nose to break. It had shattered the silence that the airline could no longer control. And fate was preparing its stage for justice to enter. The wheels of the plane screeched against the runway, a sudden jolt pulling every passenger forward in their seats. The descent had been sharp, the air thick with unease since the violence in the cabin. As the aircraft rolled to a halt at the gate, the whispers among passengers grew louder, mingling with the quick shuffle of attendants preparing for arrival. Caleb Stroud sat rigid, tissues pressed to his swollen, bloodied nose, his shirt soaked through with crimson stains that drew horrified glances from those seated nearby. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, his mind replaying the strike again and again, the sound of bone cracking, the humiliation of silence afterward. He wanted to disappear into the seat, but instead the crew ushered him forward, pushing him to be the first off the plane. The door hissed open, and cold terminal air rushed in, tinged with the sterile bite of disinfectant and the faint hum of the bustling airport beyond. 2 police officers waited just beyond the jet bridge, their posture stiff, hands resting close to their belts as they scanned the disembarking passengers. Behind them stood 2 medics, their white gloves ready, their faces hardening when they caught sight of the teenager stumbling forward with tissues clutched against his nose. The sight of blood drew gasps from waiting onlookers who pressed against the windows and cordons, their phones already lifted to record. Darren Coyle followed close behind, arms folded across his broad chest, his chin lifted with practiced arrogance. His expression was one of forced calm, though his eyes darted quickly from officer to officer, gauging which way the tide of authority might turn. Each step he took rang with defiance, as if he refused to let his earlier loss of control show. The image of his victim, the boy with trembling hands and a face still streaked with blood, only deepened the ugliness of his composure. Passengers trailed behind, whispering urgently, phones still in hand, the glow of their screens capturing what the airline would soon wish had never left the cabin. The jet bridge stretched like a tunnel, fluorescent lights humming above until it opened into the wider terminal. At its end, framed by the glow of overhead panels and the shifting shadows of curious bystanders, stood a man who did not belong to the chaos of travelers and luggage. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair graying at the temples, Judge Malcolm Stroud stood waiting, still clad in his black judicial robe. He had come straight from a courtroom session, his silver-framed glasses glinting beneath the lights, the small golden gavel pin on his collar shining like a mark of quiet authority. His presence seemed to part the air itself, silencing the restless murmurs of passengers and bystanders alike. Caleb's eyes caught sight of him, widening with a rush of relief and shame all at once. His voice cracked as he whispered, almost to himself, "Dad." His steps faltered, the weight of humiliation pressing heavier than his injury. The boy who had endured silence in the sky now found himself face to face with the one man he longed for most, the man who symbolized strength, fairness, and justice. Darren froze mid-step, his arrogance fractured in an instant, replaced by the sickly pallor of recognition. The robe was not ceremonial but real, stitched with the weight of judgment, and the stern, unyielding eyes staring back at him belonged not to an angry father, but to a man who had spent his life demanding truth in rooms where lies went to die. Darren's fingers twitched against his folded arms as though he suddenly found them heavy, his mouth parting in a silent attempt to speak. The silence deepened until Malcolm's voice cut through like the swing of a gavel. Calm, deliberate, and yet thunderous with authority, he spoke. "Who laid hands on my son?" Each syllable carried the sharpness of law itself, rippling through the gathered crowd. The officers stiffened, exchanging uncertain glances, caught between the immediate evidence before them and the weight of the man addressing them. Darren stammered, his earlier confidence shattering like glass under pressure. He was being disruptive," he muttered, his voice cracking as he pointed weakly toward Caleb. "I only acted to restrain him. He lunged at me first." The words were rushed, desperate, spilling out like a drowning man grasping for air. But the passengers who had followed, anger simmering in their expressions, surged forward. One by one, they raised their phones, screens glowing with undeniable proof, the grainy but clear video of Darren's fist lashing out, the sound of the crack, Caleb's cry. Gasps echoed anew as clips replayed on loops, the truth illuminated for all to see. The elderly man who had protested on the plane shouted firmly, "That boy did nothing but ask for water. He struck him without cause." Others chimed in, their voices rising, drowning Darren's stammering excuses. The officers hesitated, torn between protocol and the undeniable weight of testimony surrounding them. Their eyes flicked to Judge Stroud, whose gaze burned not with anger alone, but with unshakable certainty. His very presence demanded action, demanded truth. Darren's lips quivered, his posture collapsing as realization sank into his bones. This was not a scuffle that could be brushed aside, nor an incident to be buried beneath paperwork. He had not just struck a boy. He had struck the son of a man whose entire life was built on judging right from wrong. And in that moment, the hunter became the hunted. The terminal erupted in chaos the moment Caleb stepped into view, blood still streaking down his face. Reporters, tipped off by the viral footage already circulating online, surged forward with cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in a chorus of shouted questions. Microphones extended like weapons, pointed not at Darren but at the trembling boy on the medic's bench. Caleb pressed a folded cloth against his swollen nose, his hands shaking as flashes of light reflected in his glassy eyes. His body felt small under the weight of so many strangers, but the steady presence of his father standing nearby gave him an anchor. Judge Malcolm Stroud's black robe swayed slightly as he raised one hand, his voice carrying above the storm with calm authority. "Let every witness speak in truth, for truth fears no light." His words sliced through the noise, commanding silence without force. Even the reporters paused, their lenses focusing as though they understood the gravity of the moment. Passengers who had seen the attack began to step forward, voices overlapping at first but soon forming a steady rhythm of testimony. An elderly man, his hands trembling with indignation, declared, "The boy only asked for water, that's all. The flight attendant struck him without reason." A younger traveler added, "I filmed it, it's all here. He hit him, no question." Their words rose like a tide, drowning Darren's frantic protests. Darren, his face flushed and his chest heaving, tried to push back against the accusations. "He provoked me. He lunged." His voice cracked under the weight of so many eyes. Passengers jeered, their anger spilling over as shouts of "Liar!" and "We saw everything! Cut him down!" The police officers, caught between duty and the growing crowd, tightened their formation. One officer reached for the cuffs, the metal glinting under the terminal lights. But before they could close around Darren's wrists, a figure in a sharp airline uniform strode quickly through the throng. Roland Vex, the airline supervisor, carried himself with brisk confidence, his polished shoes striking the floor with an air of authority. His face bore the tight smile of a man rehearsed in diffusing crises, though his eyes flickered nervously from Darren to Judge Stroud. "This matter will be handled internally," Roland announced, his tone clipped yet steady. "Our procedures are clear. Mr. Coyle is a valued employee. We can't have public theatrics jeopardizing the reputation of the airline." A hush fell over the immediate circle. The officers hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances as Roland leaned closer, lowering his voice as if to cloak his words in secrecy. Caleb strained to hear, but the noise of the reporters drowned much of it. Only the subtle gesture of Roland slipping a sealed envelope into one officer's hand betrayed the quiet corruption taking place. Judge Stroud's gaze hardened, his jaw set like stone. His robe lent him an almost otherworldly weight, but it was his words that held the power of judgment. "No man is above the law, and no child deserves violence for asking for water." His tone was even, yet beneath it lay a heat that made Roland falter. Caleb's heart raced as he watched, his own pain momentarily forgotten in the shadow of this greater struggle. He could sense it. The fight was no longer between himself and Darren. It was larger, stretching beyond the terminal, reaching into halls of power and secrecy he had never imagined. His father's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, grounding him, but Caleb's young mind understood that this was only the beginning of something far bigger. Roland's face tightened, the confident veneer slipping as murmurs spread through the gathered passengers. Phones recorded every twitch of his expression, every unspoken word. The envelope, still half concealed in the officer's hand, seemed to burn like evidence yet unseen. Darren shifted uneasily beside him, realizing that the spotlight he once tried to control was now exposing him more than ever. Malcolm Stroud's eyes lingered on the envelope, then on the men surrounding Darren. He knew what he was witnessing, a system moving to bury the truth before it could even be spoken in court. The judge's voice lowered, but the words carried the weight of thunder. "Do not mistake silence for compliance." Caleb clenched the blood-stained cloth tighter in his hand, his mind replaying Darren's whispered threat from the plane. Keep quiet or regret it. Yet here, in the bright, merciless lights of the terminal, surrounded by witnesses and cameras, silence no longer seemed possible. He lifted his head despite the pain, meeting his father's gaze. Roland stepped back, his polished shoes losing their rhythm, his confidence fractured. The officers wavered, caught between the authority of law and the pull of influence. The crowd pressed closer, voices swelling again, demanding justice, demanding action. And in that moment, Caleb understood the path ahead would not be simple. It would be filled with obstacles, with those who would rather twist truth into lies than let justice stand. But it would also be filled with allies, with people like Lewis, like the strangers now standing up to speak for him. His father's jaw remained tight, his eyes sharp, as he watched the tug-of-war for control unfolding in front of them. The decision was not yet made, but the battle line was clear. Caleb's chest rose with a shaky breath, his fear slowly hardening into resolve. And the battle for justice had only just begun. Darren was dragged through the terminal in handcuffs, his wrists bound tightly behind his back, yet his eyes locked on Caleb with a venomous glare. The boy, clutching a bandaged nose and leaning against his father's side, felt that stare like a blade sliding across his skin. Darren's lips curled faintly, almost daring Caleb to flinch. Even as police officers escorted him away, the man's defiance lingered, leaving the boy shaken but not broken. Judge Malcolm Stroud walked beside his son, the black folds of his robe trailing like a shadow of authority through the fluorescent-lit corridor. He rested a firm hand on Caleb's shoulder, steadying his trembling frame. "Dad," Caleb whispered, his voice hoarse from both fear and pain. "He told me to keep quiet, or I'd regret it." Malcolm paused mid-step, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing with restrained fury. He lowered his gaze to his son, his voice carrying the weight of every courtroom he had ever presided over. "You did nothing wrong," he said, slow and deliberate. "Silence is the ally of the guilty." The words were like armor, but even armor could not completely shield a boy who had just tasted cruelty at its rawest. Caleb nodded faintly, though his thoughts churned with unease. Around them, curious onlookers whispered, phones still raised to capture the aftermath. Justice had only begun its climb, but already shadows were gathering against them. Meanwhile, in a glass-walled office overlooking the terminal, Roland Vex watched the scene unfold with a clenched jaw. He was a thin, sharp-featured man in a gray suit, his tie loosened as sweat dotted his forehead. He turned from the window and grabbed the phone, his voice low but urgent. "We have a problem," he hissed to the unseen executive on the other end. "If this goes unchecked, it'll spiral into a national scandal." His tone carried the sharp edge of panic. Behind him, the city lights glittered through the window, a cruel reminder that the world outside was already beginning to watch. He described the scene, Darren's arrest, the boy's injuries, the father's imposing presence, and waited for instructions. The answer came swiftly. Protect Darren at all costs, discredit the boy, and if necessary, smear the judge himself. Roland's shoulders sagged under the weight of the command, but he knew there was no choice. The machine of the airline had spoken, and its gears were already grinding toward cover-up. Down below, Judge Stroud guided Caleb into a quiet corner where medics waited. The boy winced as antiseptic dabbed his wound, the sting pulling tears to his eyes. Malcolm crouched beside him, gripping his son's hand firmly. His own mind, though calm on the surface, blazed with unspoken determination. He could sense it, the resistance, the desperation of powerful men who feared exposure more than justice. And in that resistance lay danger. That night, silence returned to the hotel where they stayed, but it was the kind of silence that hums with tension, not peace. Caleb slept fitfully in his bed, bandages taped carefully across his swollen nose. Every so often he stirred, mumbling through dreams of fists and threats. Malcolm sat at the desk, lamp casting a small circle of light, legal documents scattered across the wood. His eyes, weary yet unyielding, traced strategies on paper. He was not just a father now, he was a man preparing for war. A sudden knock at the door broke the stillness. Malcolm rose cautiously, his robe exchanged for a plain shirt, though his bearing remained regal. He opened the door to find no one standing outside. Instead, lying on the floor was a thick envelope, unmarked. He bent, lifted it, and closed the door behind him. Caleb stirred in his sleep as the envelope slid open under Malcolm's steady fingers. Inside were photographs. Darren, smiling at a company celebration, arms around senior executives. Their grins were wide, glasses raised in toasts, as if camaraderie outweighed conscience. Beneath the photos lay printed memos, internal communications laced with careful language but undeniable meaning. They spoke of incidents handled internally, of limiting exposure, of ensuring loyalty among staff. One note, highlighted in red, described an altercation with a minor passenger from months before, buried without consequence. Malcolm's breath slowed, the weight of the papers heavy in his hands. This was no longer about one violent man lashing out. This was about an entire structure built to silence, shield, and protect its own. He looked at his sleeping son, the bandages stark against his pale face. The fury in Malcolm's chest hardened into resolve. The message was clear, and it was chilling. Darren was not a rogue spark. He was the flame nurtured by a system too arrogant to believe it could ever be extinguished. The wound on Caleb's face was real, but the wound in the system was far deeper. The projector's screen flickered to life in the dimly lit conference room, the glow casting sharp lines across the polished table. On it played the heavily edited clip released by the airline. Darren speaking calmly, his voice measured, followed by shaky footage of Caleb standing, his face hidden from the camera angle. The punch, the blood, the gasps of passengers, it was all cut away, replaced instead with Darren's testimony of being provoked. The screen froze on Caleb's blurred image, the frame carefully chosen to make him look aggressive. Marcus Dalen leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, his face as still as stone. Judge Malcolm Stroud stood rigid at the back of the room, his robe exchanged for a simple suit, though his presence carried the same weight of judgment. Caleb sat at the end of the table, his eyes fixed on the floor, shame burning his cheeks. The sound of strangers' voices replayed in his mind, anchors and commentators labeling him a disruptive teen, people who had never met him but were now deciding who he was. "I didn't do anything," Caleb whispered, his voice breaking as he lifted his gaze to his father. "They're making it look like I deserved it." His trembling hands gripped the edges of his chair until his knuckles turned white. Judge Stroud's reply came with the firmness of a gavel striking wood. "The truth may be delayed, but it cannot be denied." His voice was low but powerful, anchoring Caleb in the storm. His sharp eyes scanned the frozen frame on the screen as though he could cut through its deception by will alone. Marcus exhaled slowly and turned off the projector. "This is the battle we face," he said, his tone measured but edged with steel. "They have money, influence, and a head start in shaping the narrative. But we have something they don't: witnesses who lived it, evidence that can't be erased, and courage they cannot buy." He glanced at Caleb directly, his calm voice steady. "You wanted to testify. You'll get your chance. But you must understand, it will not be easy. They will try to twist your words, your silence, even your face into something it is not." Caleb swallowed hard, but he sat straighter. "I want him to hear me," he said, his eyes narrowing with quiet determination. "He has to hear my voice, not just yours." The firmness in his tone surprised even him, and Malcolm nodded approvingly, pride softening his stern features. The door creaked open, and a man stepped hesitantly into the room. He was lean, his hair cut short, his suit a little worn. His eyes darted nervously as he introduced himself. Elias Wren. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight, like someone who had been waiting too long to be heard. He shifted uncomfortably as Marcus gestured him inside. Elias sat down, his fingers drumming lightly on the table before he clasped them together to stop the shaking. "I used to work with Darren," he began, his voice tightening with each word. "I know what he did to your boy, and I know it's not the first time." His eyes flicked toward Caleb, softening with the sorrow that came from memory. "A year ago, there was another passenger, a boy, maybe 12. He asked for a blanket, and Darren—" Elias paused, his voice catching. "Darren snapped. He shoved the kid, hard enough to bruise his ribs. When the parents threatened to complain, the airline paid them off. I was told to forget what I saw." Caleb's breath caught in his chest, his heart pounding. He had thought he was alone in his suffering, that Darren's cruelty had singled him out. But now the picture widened, and his pain connected to others. He whispered, almost to himself, "So, it wasn't just me." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes sharpening. "Can you testify to this?" His tone was calm, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. Elias hesitated, his jaw tightening as he weighed the risk. "It could cost me everything. Darren's got friends in management. They'll say I'm lying, that I'm bitter for leaving." He shook his head, frustration etched into every line of his face. "But I can't stay quiet anymore. Someone has to speak, or he'll keep getting away with it." Judge Stroud's deep voice filled the room. "Silence protects the guilty. Your words could protect the innocent." His gaze locked on Elias, steady and unyielding. The room fell quiet, the weight of the moment pressing on all of them. Caleb lifted his eyes to Elias, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Please," he said softly, "if you tell them, they'll know it wasn't just me. They'll see what he really is." Elias's eyes glistened as he gave a slow nod. "Then I'll testify." Marcus leaned back, a thin smile breaking through his usual calm. "This changes everything. A pattern of abuse, covered up by the airline. It's no longer about one incident. It's about an entire system built to protect men like Darren." Caleb felt the words settle into him, heavy but also empowering. The shame he had carried began to shift into something else, resolve. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, firm and steady, grounding him. In that dimly lit room, with the weight of lies pressing against them, a small flame of truth began to burn brighter. Caleb sat taller, his bandaged nose a scar of what had happened but also a mark of endurance. Darren's shadow loomed large, but now it was no longer just Caleb's burden to fight. Others had been hurt. Others had been silenced. And with Elias's voice joining theirs, silence was ending. The battle ahead would be long, but for the first time, Caleb believed they had the strength to win. The case was no longer just about Caleb. It was about every voice the airline had silenced. He broke a black teen's nose and thought fear would erase the truth. If you believe cruelty must face consequences, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The wooden gavel struck against the block, its sharp crack echoing through the courtroom as silence fell. Reporters shifted forward, pens poised, cameras ready to capture every flicker of expression. Darren Coyle strolled in with a swagger, his lips curled into a mocking smirk, his expensive suit pressed to perfection as though image alone could shield him from the weight of the truth. He walked with his chin lifted, flanked by a wall of well-paid attorneys whose polished shoes clicked against the marble floor like a drumbeat of arrogance. His eyes scanned the crowd briefly before locking on Caleb Stroud. He held his gaze, the smirk widening as if daring the boy to meet his stare. Caleb sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture rigid, the white bandage still wrapped neatly across the bridge of his nose. The boy's hands tightened against his knees, knuckles pale, but he did not look away. Inside, his heart hammered like a drum of panic and defiance combined, but his father's quiet voice echoed in his memory. "Stand firm when you know you are right." That steadiness anchored him. He lifted his chin, his young eyes meeting Darren's mocking glare with a determination that belied his age. The presiding judge, a stern man with thinning hair and a voice that carried both authority and impatience, called the court to order. The murmurs of the gallery, reporters whispering, activists shifting with restless anticipation, onlookers holding their breath, faded into tense silence. At once, Marcus Dalen, Caleb's attorney, rose. His frame was lean, his movements deliberate, and his voice, though calm, carried the weight of something far sharper than outrage. "A boy asked for water," Marcus said, turning to face the jury, his eyes sweeping over their watchful faces. He let the pause hang in the air, long enough for every ear in the room to lean forward. "Instead, he was given blood." The words cut through the silence like glass shattering. Several jurors exchanged startled glances. Gasps fluttered across the gallery while reporters' pens scratched faster against their notepads. Caleb's stomach tightened, the memory of the blow rushing back with the sting of humiliation. Across the room, Darren leaned back in his chair, his smugness unshaken, arms crossed as though he had heard this all before. His lawyers sat still, unreadable masks of composure. One of Darren's attorneys, a broad man with a clipped accent and steady posture, rose with rehearsed confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began smoothly, his tone coated with courtesy, "this was not the story of a boy requesting water. This was the story of an employee forced to defend himself against a disruptive, unruly teenager who lunged at him in a moment of tension." A murmur rolled through the audience, disbelief mixing with curiosity. The attorney pressed on, gesturing subtly toward Caleb. "The evidence will show my client acted in self-defense, reacting to protect not only himself but the other passengers aboard that flight." Caleb's face flushed red, not from shame but from the sting of hearing his truth twisted into something ugly. He wanted to shout, to cry out that it was a lie, but Marcus's steady hand touched his shoulder, reminding him to stay calm. His silence in that moment was not weakness, it was strategy. The jury shifted uneasily, caught between the boy's fragile presence and the lawyer's polished argument. Darren leaned slightly forward, his eyes gleaming with mockery, as though savoring every moment of the false narrative that painted him as the victim. His lips curled, his expression practically daring Caleb to falter. But the tide began to shift when Marcus rose again. His voice was quiet, controlled, but beneath it lay a sharp edge. "Let us hear from someone who knew Darren Coyle long before this flight, someone who saw firsthand what kind of man he is." All eyes turned toward the back as the bailiff guided a man forward. Elias Wren stepped into the light, his suit slightly worn, his hands clasped tightly together as though gripping courage itself. His eyes darted nervously toward Darren, then to the judge, then finally to the jury. When he took the stand, his first words trembled. "My name is Elias Wren," he began, his voice unsteady but clear enough for all to hear. "I worked with Darren Coyle for 3 years." The defense lawyers shifted in their seats, one of them already preparing to object, but Marcus gestured for silence, waiting. Elias swallowed hard, sweat glistening faintly on his forehead. "At first," Elias continued, "I thought Darren was just difficult. But then I saw him strike another passenger, a boy not much older than Caleb, during a flight last year." A stunned hush fell over the courtroom. The words landed like a stone tossed into still water, rippling outward through every corner of the room. Darren's smirk faltered, his jaw tightening as his eyes narrowed toward Elias with venom. Elias's voice wavered again, but then it steadied, each syllable carrying a heavier weight. "The airline covered it up. They told us to keep quiet, that it would damage the company if it came out. They paid off the family and warned me never to speak of it again. But when I saw Caleb's face on the news, I couldn't stay silent." The gallery erupted with gasps and whispers, reporters scrambling to capture every word. The judge banged his gavel for order, but the tension could not be contained. Jurors leaned forward in disbelief, their expressions shifting from doubt to outrage. Caleb's chest swelled with something he hadn't felt since the punch on the plane. Hope. Darren's once smug face drained of its confidence. He shifted in his chair, his hands tightening around the edge of the table. For the first time, a crack split through his polished facade, his mask of superiority slipping under the weight of truth. And as Elias's testimony echoed in the silent chamber, every eye turned once more toward Darren Coyle. The fortress of lies was beginning to crumble. The courtroom was hushed, every eye locked on the screen as the grainy video footage flickered to life. The sound of muffled voices filled the air, the faint chime of the service button, Caleb's soft request for water, and then the sudden, violent crack of Darren's fist striking his face. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the image froze on Caleb clutching his nose, blood already spilling down his shirt. Jurors shifted in their seats, some leaning forward as though they needed to see it again to believe it. The video had been fought over for days, nearly excluded on technical grounds, but now it played in the open, impossible to ignore. Caleb sat stiffly beside his father, his fingers digging into the armrest, reliving every second as if the blow had just landed again. Across the aisle, Darren's smugness began to falter, though he kept his jaw clenched tight, his lawyers whispering rapidly at his ear. Marcus Dalen, calm yet relentless, stepped toward the jury box. "You have seen it with your own eyes. A boy asked for water. What he received was violence." His words carried a heavy silence with them, each one landing like a gavel. For a brief moment, momentum seemed firmly in Caleb's favor. Witnesses had painted a clear picture. The footage confirmed their accounts, and the boy's quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to Darren's arrogance. Caleb allowed himself a small breath of hope. Perhaps, finally, the truth was strong enough to stand. But Darren's attorneys were not finished. The lead lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Vincent Harrow, rose with a stack of papers in hand. His tone was cold, almost triumphant. The defense would like to enter into record the medical assessment from Dr. Bernard Hale, who examined the alleged injuries. He paused for effect before sliding copies across the table. The judge allowed it. Murmurs stirred in the gallery as Harrow adjusted his glasses and read aloud. According to Dr. Hale, the boy suffered only minor bruising, no fracture, no concussion. The injuries were consistent with a fall, not an intentional strike. The words hit Caleb like a second blow. His face burned, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. Around him, whispers rose, jurors exchanging uncertain glances, spectators frowning in confusion. Caleb turned desperately to his father. "Dad, how can they say that?" His voice cracked, heavy with disbelief. Judge Stroud's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening over Caleb's shoulder. "They are trying to rewrite reality," he muttered, his voice low and thunderous. Vincent Harrow pressed forward, sensing advantage. He gestured toward Caleb with calculated scorn. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are seeing here is exaggeration. A boy tripped, he stumbled, and now a hard-working man's life is being destroyed over a misunderstanding." Darren straightened in his seat, smirking faintly, as if victory were returning to his side. The gallery buzzed with unease. Even the jury shifted again, doubt seeping in like a shadow creeping across the floor. Caleb's heart pounded in his ears. Was truth really so fragile that it could be buried beneath paper and lies? Marcus did not flinch. He stood slowly, his calmness deliberate, drawing all eyes to him. In his hand, he carried a sealed folder, edges worn from being handled too often. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and steady, "the prosecution anticipated this deception. We move to admit the original medical records from City Memorial Hospital, taken the night of the incident." He placed the folder on the bench with quiet finality. "These records, signed by attending physicians with no connection to the airline, confirm beyond doubt a broken nasal bone and a concussion." The judge raised his brow and gestured for the clerk to bring the documents forward. Papers shuffled, the silence almost unbearable. Then the truth unfolded in black and white. Caleb's x-rays, his diagnosis, the detailed notes describing blunt force trauma. The gallery erupted, voices rising in disbelief and outrage. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing. Marcus's voice cut through the noise like a blade. The so-called report from Dr. Hale was not just a mistake. It was a forgery. A hamasidvanit igi oyan ferfi irta Allah, aki anyagi kapsulatban alt as Apex Airlines shell. He turned sharply toward the defense table, his eyes locking on Darren. They tried to erase the truth with ink, but ink cannot erase bone. Darren's smirk collapsed into a tight grimace. His attorneys scrambled, whispering frantically, their strategy crumbling before the jury's eyes. Jurors leaned forward now, anger etched into their faces. The earlier flicker of doubt consumed by indignation. Caleb felt his chest swell with something fierce and unfamiliar. Not fear, not humiliation, but vindication. The pain in his nose and the sleepless nights had meaning now. They could no longer call him a liar. Judge Stroud leaned close, his voice quiet enough only for his son to hear. "You see, Caleb? Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to endure long enough to be heard." Caleb blinked, fighting back tears, but this time they were not born of despair. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order as voices still surged through the gallery. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the room. A collective recognition that something larger than a single boy's broken nose had been exposed. The airline's carefully built wall of lies was cracking, piece by piece, under the relentless pressure of truth. Darren hunched low in his chair, sweat glistening on his brow, his arrogance stripped bare. Caleb sat straighter, breathing deeply, as if he had finally reclaimed the air stolen from him on that plane. He knew the fight was not yet over, but for the first time, he felt the ground beneath him steady. The jury's eyes had changed. They were no longer uncertain. They were listening, and they were angry. As the gavel struck again, echoing through the chamber, the story of lies and corruption was no longer hidden in whispers or shadows. It rang through the courtroom, undeniable and loud. The truth was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. The courtroom was still when Darren took the stand. His posture was rigid, his expression carefully composed, but there was a restless flicker in his eyes as though he was gambling on a desperate move. The silence deepened when his lawyer asked him to explain the moment that had sparked the entire case. Darren's voice was steady at first, low but loud enough to carry through the room. "The boy," he said, gesturing toward Caleb with a pointed hand, "used racial slurs against me. He insulted me again and again until I lost control. I regret my reaction, but I was provoked." The words fell like a stone into water, sending ripples of shock through the room. A gasp rose from the gallery, and all eyes turned toward Caleb. The boy's face went pale, his lips parting as though the air had been stolen from him. He leaned forward in his chair, his hands tightening against his knees. His voice came out as a whisper, cracked and trembling but filled with disbelief. "That's not true." The jury's faces revealed a dangerous shift. Some leaned back, doubt flashing across their eyes, while others frowned, clearly torn. The claim was poisonous, twisting the image of Caleb from victim to aggressor in a single accusation. Darren sat straighter, emboldened by the flicker of hesitation he had caused. He kept his gaze fixed on the jurors, avoiding Caleb's eyes, as if willing them to believe his lie. His lawyer nodded approvingly, sensing that the fabricated story might sway at least a few minds. Caleb felt the room closing in. His chest tightened, his throat dry. He wanted to shout, to protest, but his father's hand touched his shoulder gently, grounding him. Judge Stroud's steady grip reminded him of all the lessons he had carried: patience, composure, truth. Caleb swallowed hard, fighting back tears. His mind screamed, "Why are they even considering this? Why would they believe him over me?" The humiliation of being doubted gnawed at his stomach, heavier than the pain of his broken nose. The prosecutor, Marcus Dalen, rose slowly. His movements were calm, deliberate, and his voice carried a quiet weight as he stepped closer to the witness stand. "Mr. Coyle," Marcus said, his eyes steady, "you're asking this court to believe that a 16-year-old boy shouted racial slurs at you, provoking you to violence?" Darren nodded quickly, seizing the chance to repeat himself. "Yes, that is exactly what happened. He taunted me until I snapped. I had no choice." The murmur of the courtroom grew louder, uneasy. Caleb felt his breath catch. For a brief, horrifying moment, he saw the possibility of the lie working. He saw the jury leaning toward Darren's story, their doubt forming walls against the truth. His heart pounded in his ears, his vision swimming. This was how injustice happened, not with silence, but with words twisted into weapons. Marcus let the silence hang for a moment, his footsteps echoing lightly against the polished floor as he paced. Then, with a faint nod, he turned toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "the defense has given us a story. But the truth has already been captured." He raised a small device, sleek and ordinary, yet carrying a power that made the room still again. "A recording from a passenger seated 3 rows away. It captures every word of the exchange." Gasps filled the room. Darren's face stiffened, his confidence faltering. His hands gripped the edge of the stand, knuckles white. Caleb's head lifted, his eyes widening with sudden hope, his breath breaking free from his chest. The judge gestured for the playback to begin. A hush fell as the faint crackle of audio filled the courtroom. Caleb's voice came first, soft and respectful. "Excuse me, sir. May I have some water, please?" A pause, then Darren's reply, sharp and dismissive, "Wait your turn." The audio continued, each exchange layering the truth for all to hear. Caleb's calm persistence, Darren's escalating anger, and then the sharp, sickening crack of the punch. A cry of pain, the shuffle of passengers, chaos erupting. But never, not once, the slurs Darren had claimed. The jury leaned forward, every face intent, the deception dissolving before their ears. Darren's head dropped slightly, his jaw tight, his breathing shallow. He tried to maintain composure, but the pale hue spreading across his face betrayed him. The gallery murmured in outrage, some shaking their heads, others glaring openly at the man who had tried to smear a boy's character to save his own. Caleb's heart pounded, but now it was with relief, not despair. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but this time they were not born of helplessness. He glanced at his father, whose grip on his shoulder tightened in approval. The jury's doubt had evaporated, replaced with something fiercer, anger at being lied to so blatantly. The balance had shifted. Darren sat in silence, his earlier smugness gone, his lips pressed tight as if the weight of his falsehood had crushed him. His lawyer shifted uneasily, avoiding eye contact with the jury. The room no longer belonged to Darren. It belonged to the truth, and the truth was undeniable. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, inhaling a steadying breath. For the first time in weeks he felt a weight lifting from his chest, as if the lie that had threatened to bury him had collapsed under its own rot. He opened his eyes to see his father watching him, his expression stern but proud. Leaning close, Judge Stroud whispered with quiet finality, "The lie has devoured its master. Now justice can breathe." The foreman rose from his seat, the sound of the wooden chair legs scraping against the floor echoing like a drumbeat through the hushed courtroom. Every eye turned to him, the weight of expectation pressing against the air until it felt almost impossible to breathe. Caleb sat frozen between his father and Marcus, his heart hammering so hard he feared the jury might hear it. His palms were damp, clenched into fists against his knees, but his trembling betrayed him. Across the room, Darren Coyle sat hunched forward, his once arrogant posture broken down into something unsteady. Sweat gleamed along his hairline, and for the first time since the trial began, he avoided meeting Caleb's eyes. The judge's gavel tapped once, steadying the room. "Order. The jury will deliver its verdict." His voice was solemn, carrying authority that silenced the whispers running through the crowd. The foreman unfolded a slip of paper with shaking hands, though his voice was steady when he spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of assault." A gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by a swell of murmurs. Caleb's breath caught in his throat, his vision blurring as tears pressed against the corners of his eyes. His broken nose had long since healed, but the memory of that punch lived in his bones. Now, the acknowledgement of guilt gave him his first breath of safety in weeks. The foreman's voice carried on. "Guilty of falsification of testimony. Guilty of conspiring with Apex Airlines to conceal misconduct." The final words struck like thunder. A stunned silence swept across the courtroom before breaking into gasps, cries of outrage and applause that reverberated against the walls. The bailiff barked for quiet, but the energy refused to settle quickly. Caleb blinked hard, and the tears finally slipped free, rolling down his cheeks as he pressed his lips together to keep from sobbing aloud. Darren's lawyers shifted in their seats, their earlier bravado collapsed into grim resignation. One of them rubbed his temple as though the weight of defeat had suddenly grown too heavy. Darren himself stiffened in his chair, his hands curling into fists on the table. His face was pale, and his eyes darted wildly, searching the room as though he still hoped for a miracle to overturn what had just been declared. The smirk he had worn throughout the trial was gone, replaced by a trembling scowl that betrayed his fear. Judge Malcolm Stroud leaned slightly toward his son, his hand resting firmly on Caleb's shoulder. His eyes softened, but his jaw was set with the strength of a man who had seen justice delivered and knew its cost. "You did it," he whispered, his voice low and steady. "You stood firm." Caleb swallowed hard, nodding faintly, though his whole body trembled with relief and exhaustion. The presiding judge lifted his gavel again, his tone grave. "Order in the court. The jury has spoken, and the verdict is final. Furthermore, this court finds sufficient cause to order a federal inquiry into Apex Airlines itself. Evidence presented during this trial has revealed patterns of systemic abuse and corruption. Such allegations demand investigation at the highest level." The announcement struck harder than the verdict itself. The reporters in the gallery sprang to their feet, pens scratching furiously across notebooks, cameras flashing as they captured the moment. Activists whispered to one another with urgent excitement, sensing the case had just grown beyond a single act of violence. The murmurs rose again, filling the chamber with electric tension. Caleb felt the words vibrate through him. His case, his pain, had become the spark for something much larger. He leaned closer to his father and whispered, "It's bigger than me, isn't it?" Malcolm's expression was heavy with both pride and sorrow. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of truth. "This case was never just about you. It was about every child they thought they could silence." The bailiff stepped forward, gesturing for Darren to rise. Chains clinked as the officer snapped the cuffs around his wrists. Darren flinched at the sound, his body jerking like a man who had never believed the law could truly touch him. As he was led from the table, his eyes swept once more across the courtroom, wild and frantic, as though seeking a lifeline that was no longer there. His lips moved silently, but no words came, his fear suffocating the arrogance that once defined him. The reporters shouted questions, but the officers pushed Darren forward, their grip firm on his arms. The clang of the shackles against the polished floor echoed through the silent chamber as Darren stumbled toward the exit, his head bowed at last. Caleb watched, the sting of tears softening his vision, but within him a fire of vindication burned. The presiding judge's gavel struck sharply one final time. "This court is adjourned." The sound cut clean through the noise, marking an end, yet also a beginning. Caleb exhaled shakily, leaning into the steady presence of his father. For the first time since that terrible night in the air, he felt as though the weight crushing his chest had finally lifted. The chapter of fear was closing, but beyond it lay a battle for truth much larger than his own. And with that, Darren was escorted out of the courtroom, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting wildly, as if still searching for an escape. And with that, the scales of justice began to tip back toward truth. The cameras flashed in rapid succession as Caleb stepped into the courthouse lobby, his footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor. Reporters pressed forward, microphones stretched like spears, voices overlapping in a frantic chorus of questions. "Caleb, how are you feeling? Do you have a message for the airline? Are you afraid of retaliation?" The barrage of voices closed in on him, each word piercing through his fragile composure. He lowered his gaze, shoulders tense, his hand brushing the edge of the bandage hidden beneath his sleeve. His nose had healed, yes, but the memory of Darren's fist still lingered in the shadows of his mind. Malcolm Stroud, tall and immovable beside his son, raised a hand in quiet command. The noise softened, though eyes still watched, hungry for a statement. Caleb pressed closer to his father, drawing steadiness from the firm presence at his side. His father did not speak, only placed a guiding hand on his shoulder, a silent message. "You decide when your voice is ready." Caleb swallowed hard, the silence around him more suffocating than the questions themselves. Later, in the dim-lit office of their attorney Marcus Dalen, the atmosphere was calmer but no less pressing. Marcus leaned forward, his sharp eyes fixed on Caleb. "You cannot remain silent forever, son," Marcus said softly, his voice even but weighted. "The world has seen what happened, but they need to hear it from you. Not your father. Not me. You." His words settled heavily in the air. Caleb shifted uneasily in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together. "I don't know if I can," Caleb admitted, his voice barely audible. He stared at the floor, memories flooding back unbidden, the shock of the blow, the warm rush of blood, the mocking grin on Darren's face. "What if I freeze? What if I say the wrong thing?" Marcus leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Strength isn't about perfection. It's about truth. You've already survived the worst moment. Now, you just need to tell the world what it felt like. They will listen." His tone carried a calm assurance as though he had already seen the outcome. Caleb turned to his father, searching for guidance. Malcolm's eyes, steady and unblinking, met his own. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Caleb," he said, his deep voice carrying the weight of both wisdom and experience. "It is standing tall while fear tries to pull you down." That night, Caleb lay awake in the quiet of the hotel room, staring at the ceiling while the city hummed faintly outside. His father was asleep in the adjoining bed, but Caleb's mind churned with restless thoughts. He imagined standing before rows of flashing cameras, his voice trembling, his words stumbling. Then he imagined staying silent, allowing others to shape the story, twisting it into something it was not. His chest tightened at the thought. Slowly, he realized silence was its own prison. When dawn came, he felt lighter, though the fear still sat in his stomach. By midday, a press conference was arranged. The room was crowded, Rows of cameras lined at the back, journalists whispering among themselves as they shuffled papers and adjusted microphones. The air was thick with anticipation, every lens waiting to capture the moment. Marcus adjusted Caleb's tie, his hands steady. "Just speak from your heart. That is all anyone needs." Malcolm placed a firm hand on his son's back as they approached the podium. Caleb's legs trembled slightly, but he forced himself forward, each step carrying more weight than the last. When he stood before the crowd, the hum of conversation ceased. Dozens of eyes bore into him, the silence demanding words. He gripped the podium, his fingers white-knuckled, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. For a long moment, no sound came. His throat tightened, the words locked behind fear. But then he remembered his father's voice, Marcus's calm encouragement, and the truth that had carried him this far. He inhaled deeply. "I only asked for water," Caleb began, his voice soft but clear, resonating in the silence. The words echoed, carried further than he expected. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, cameras locked. "What I received was violence, but the truth is stronger than fear." The silence held for a heartbeat before erupting into applause and shouts of questions. Caleb's chest heaved, but he stood taller now, the weight of silence lifted from his shoulders. His words spread across news feeds within minutes, echoing far beyond the walls of the press room. Across the nation, people listened, many nodding, many angered, many inspired. Meanwhile, in corporate offices far from the courthouse, panic spread. Executives at Apex Airlines watched the broadcast, their faces pale. Behind closed doors, whispered conversations revealed what Caleb did not yet know. His voice had opened the door to a flood. Investigators were uncovering decades of ignored complaints, settlements hidden in secrecy, and a culture built on silence. Resignations began, one after another, each name a domino falling. Caleb left the podium that day with trembling hands but steadier steps. For the first time since the flight, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt the weight of change beginning to shift. He was no longer just the boy who bled in silence on row 14. He was a voice that refused to be quiet, a spark that had ignited something larger than himself. And the boy, who once sat quietly in row 14, was now being heard by millions. The boardroom erupted with flashes of cameras as federal officials signed the mandate that would change Apex Airlines forever. The decision was clear. Reforms were no longer optional. Executives sat rigidly, their polished suits doing little to hide the unease in their faces. The air smelled faintly of ink and paper, yet beneath it was the weight of history pressing down. Judge Malcolm Stroud, his robe traded for a sharp black suit, stood at the center of the announcement, his expression calm but commanding. "Oversight is not a suggestion," he said, his voice resonating through the crowded chamber. "It is a duty." His words cut through the hum of reporters, and for a moment, silence reigned. The same man who had walked down courthouse aisles for years now stood as a symbol of accountability, appointed to lead the independent review board that would monitor Apex's reforms. Outside the glass walls of the press hall, Caleb sat quietly on a bench, his school bag at his feet. His bandaged nose had long since healed, but the scars of the incident clung to him in ways unseen. Students at his school had treated him differently since the trial. Whispers in hallways, sudden bursts of applause when he entered classrooms, and classmates staring at him as if he were part of some legend. The attention made his stomach twist. He never sought to be a symbol. He had only wanted water. Yet when his father exited the press hall and joined him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder, Caleb realized his journey was already reshaping more lives than he could imagine. The tension of recognition followed him back into the classroom. That first Monday morning, as he stepped through the doorway, a hush fell. Desks scraped as students turned, their eyes wide, their admiration unspoken but heavy. His teacher, Mr. Kellen, paused mid-sentence, his chalk resting against the board. "Welcome back, Caleb," he said softly, with a proud smile tugging at his lips. Caleb nodded faintly, his cheeks warming. He slid into his seat, trying to focus on the lesson, but he could feel it, every eye on him. Later at lunch, a boy named Terrence, usually loud and teasing, sat across from him with unexpected seriousness. "You stood up to them," Terrence muttered, shaking his head. "I couldn't have done that." Caleb met his gaze, unsure how to respond. "I didn't stand up alone," he whispered, thinking of the passengers, Marcus and his father. But deep inside, he knew that even with their help, it had been his choice not to stay silent. That evening, the television replayed footage of the federal announcement. Malcolm Stroud's face filled the screen, delivering lines of resolve that echoed in living rooms across the nation. Caleb sat on the couch, fiddling with the strap of his watch, while Marcus Dalen leaned forward in an armchair nearby. The lawyer's voice was calm but urgent. "This is bigger than one family. Caleb, you've become a voice. People will listen now." Caleb frowned. "I don't want fame." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Not fame. Purpose. There are others, kids, passengers, who went through things like you did, but no one ever believed them. What if we built something? A foundation. A place where they could come, where their voices couldn't be buried." Caleb's heart thudded at the word foundation. He stared at Marcus, then at his father, who remained silent for a moment before speaking. "It's not just possible. It's necessary." Malcolm's tone carried both pride and gravity. Caleb hesitated, torn between the weight of his age and the weight of what was being asked of him. "But I'm just 16, he said, his voice soft but steady. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped. 16 is exactly why this matters. People will see that even the young can demand justice. The following days blurred into planning sessions. Marcus laid out documents on the dining table, his finger tracing outlines of bylaws and proposals. Malcolm called in old colleagues, men of law and ethics who offered guidance and credibility. Caleb, though uncertain, attended every meeting, his eyes sharp as he listened. One evening, Marcus slid a folder toward him. "This is the charter," he said. "The name." Caleb's fingers trembled as he flipped through the pages. His mind flashed back to the airplane cabin, the sting of the blow, and the silence that had followed. He thought of the passengers who had spoken up, of Elias Wren who had testified, of every child whose voice was ignored. He raised his head. "The Stroud Foundation for Passenger Rights," he said firmly. Malcolm's lips curved into a rare smile, his hand tightening on his son's shoulder. The first press release came a week later. Caleb stood behind the podium, his voice echoing through microphones, the bright lights pressing into his eyes. "I only asked for water," he began, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "What I received was violence, but I stand here because I believe no one should endure that silence again. This foundation will protect passengers. We will make sure their voices are heard." Applause thundered across the hall, but Caleb barely heard it. He was lost in the clarity of the moment. Reporters filled the front row, scribbling, their cameras flashing, capturing the image of a boy turned advocate. Malcolm watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable but proud. Marcus whispered to a colleague, "Out of pain, he's building something unshakable." In that instant, Caleb realized he had found something greater than survival. He had found purpose, and though the path ahead promised obstacles, he was ready. For the first time, Caleb felt his suffering had a purpose, not only to heal himself but to prevent others from enduring the same. Out of pain had risen a mission. Caleb's eyes followed the movement of the trainees as they acted out a safety drill inside the wide, brightly lit training hall. The air carried the faint smell of new paint and polished floors, the room gleaming with fresh promise. He sat quietly beside his father, Judge Malcolm Stroud, watching the men in crisp uniforms speak calmly, their gestures measured and respectful as they handled a staged disagreement between two passengers. Every detail was precise, the even tone of their voices, the way they diffused tension rather than stoked it, the way they listened. For Caleb, it was as if he were seeing the opposite reflection of the moment that had once shattered his peace. His chest tightened, a faint memory rushing back, the echo of a fist, the taste of iron, the fear that silence might bury him. Yet now, in this place, that darkness seemed distant, almost outshone by the light that filled the room. "You see the difference?" Malcolm asked, his deep voice low but steady, almost reverent. His hand came to rest on Caleb's shoulder, firm and reassuring. Caleb turned his head, catching the glint of pride in his father's eyes. "This is change, son, and it began with you." Caleb lowered his gaze, unsure how to answer. The thought weighed heavily on him, how something so small, a request for water, had grown into this vast movement. He wanted to feel proud, but instead he felt humbled. "I didn't plan any of this," he said quietly, his voice almost swallowed by the training hall's acoustics. "I just asked for something simple." His father squeezed his shoulder. "And that is what makes it powerful. You turned injustice into change. That is the mark of true courage." Malcolm's words hung in the air like an oath, filling Caleb with both warmth and unease. Courage, Caleb thought, was not what he had felt that night. He had been scared, ashamed, angry. But courage, perhaps, was not the absence of fear. It was standing anyway. The trainer in front clapped his hands sharply, and the session shifted into another exercise. This time, a mock passenger refused instructions. Instead of raising his voice or using force, the trainee lowered himself slightly, speaking calmly until the actor portraying the passenger nodded in agreement. Caleb watched with fascination, realizing how easily a single choice could determine the line between respect and harm. A soft murmur rose among the watching supervisors, all nodding with approval. Malcolm leaned back slightly in his chair, his black robe replaced today by a dark suit, though he carried himself with the same gravitas. "It's not just about new rules," he said, his eyes fixed on the men in training. "It's about new habits. Habits become culture, and culture either protects or destroys." Caleb listened intently, letting the weight of his father's words settle in. He knew this battle was not over, but for the first time, he saw proof that progress could be real. Yet shadows lingered in his mind. Darren Coyle's face, twisted in arrogance, still appeared unbidden in his thoughts. The memory of his mocking tone, of the fist that came too fast to stop, clung to him like a scar invisible to others. Darren was gone now, locked away where he could harm no one, but Caleb knew systems outlived men. There would always be others like him, different faces, same contempt. The training hall, with its bright lights and clean lines, was a step forward, but the world beyond still held places where truth was buried and power was abused. Lewis Granger, the businessman who had once whispered encouragement on the flight, appeared briefly in Caleb's memory. His words had been simple but steady. "Keep your head up. People are watching." Those words had guided him through the storm, and now, sitting here, Caleb understood them in a new way. People were still watching, not just him, but this entire transformation. Every step forward was a signal to others who had once been silenced. A soft knock echoed at the side of the hall, drawing Caleb's eyes toward a glass door where a young man in a gray uniform entered, holding a clipboard. He whispered something to one of the supervisors, who frowned slightly before nodding. Caleb caught the brief tension, the subtle shift in tone. His stomach tightened. Change, he thought, was fragile. There would be resistance, pushback from those who had thrived under silence. He could sense it, even if no one said it aloud. Dramatic irony lingered here. While the surface gleamed with progress, the battle beneath was far from over. Malcolm seemed to notice Caleb's silence. "What troubles you?" he asked, his voice gentle now, stripped of its usual authority. Caleb hesitated, then spoke honestly. "What if this doesn't last? What if it's just for now, just because people are watching?" His eyes dropped to the floor, his voice tight. "What if it all goes back to how it was?" His father regarded him for a long moment, then answered with measured calm. "That is why you cannot stop. Change is not a single moment. It is a series of choices, made again and again, and it requires men willing to keep standing when the world sits down." The words steadied Caleb, but they also carried weight. He felt responsibility pressing on him, more than he thought he could bear. Yet beneath that pressure was also resolve, a quiet flame that refused to go out. He thought of the Stroud Foundation, which he and Marcus had launched with little more than hope. Already, letters and calls were pouring in from families across the country, each carrying their own stories of silence and pain. Caleb was no longer just a boy who had been struck. He had become a voice others leaned on, and with that came duty. The trainer dismissed the group, and the men in uniform filed out, their voices low, their steps quick. The hall grew quiet again, sunlight streaming through tall windows. Caleb rose slowly from his seat, stretching his still stiff shoulders. His father followed, his presence calm and commanding even in silence. They walked together toward the exit, their steps echoing softly against the polished floor. As the door swung open, a burst of bright morning sun spilled across Caleb's face. He paused, blinking against the light, feeling its warmth settle into him. His chest rose with a steady breath, the cool air of a new day filling his lungs. The world outside was wide, unpredictable, but no longer something he feared. He knew scars would remain and memories would resurface, but they would not define him. His father stopped beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder one last time. Caleb looked out across the training center courtyard, where new recruits gathered in lines, their voices carrying faintly on the breeze. He thought of everything that had brought him here: the punch, the blood, the courtroom, the truth that had refused to die. It all converged into this single moment of quiet strength, and as he stepped outside that day, into the bright morning sun, he felt not like a victim, but like a survivor who had reshaped the world. Sometimes, the smallest request, just a glass of water, can uncover the greatest truths. Then the doors opened, his father stepped in wearing a judge's robe, and the bully's bravado vanished. If you stand for dignity and accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It addresses themes of racism, unchecked anger, and the abuse of power against vulnerable individuals. Its purpose is to raise awareness about discrimination, provoke thought on accountability in everyday settings, and inspire empathy and action toward justice and respect.